to you the new Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Business and Law, Professor Grant Michelson, who I'm sure has an equally entertaining career history, and he's only just very recently joined ECU. A month or two ago?
Yeah, that's right.
Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Grant Michelson, as Margaret indicated, I joined the university on the 4th of June this year, so I'm very much new to the institution, but I'm probably feeling well travelled in terms of where I've been, and we'll come to that in terms of some of those issues. What I'll talk about intersects a lot with Ken, but also takes a different perspective, and I think that's useful for us to appreciate that building a track record, if you like, can take different paths, and rather than saying there's one size fits all, in many ways, you know, the candour of I think all of the speakers are really saying that people have regrets, people wish they've done things differently, but of course the key issue I think for us, Ken, and I would agree with Ken on this, is to continue to enjoy what we do. You know, the research itself, even though both Ken and I and others are in management roles around research at the moment, there's nothing that gives us a greater thrill than getting back to the coalface, if you like, of research. And it's forums like this that I'm particularly interested in presenting at, encouraging others in terms of mentoring, reading work, commenting on where they're going, giving advice, listening to their ideas. So I sort of took this, the title of this session, Building Track Record, and I was thinking about this, and I was seeing track record both as a metaphor and as a game. And what I mean by this is that if you're thinking about track record, someone who's running on the track, we think of terms like personal best, which I think is really the idea of stretch. You know, I get a lot more excited by the person who comes 5th in the final of the 200 metres and reacts accordingly in terms of his or her time, than the person who comes 2nd or 3rd and is as dour as anything. In other words, they expected to win, they didn't, but the person who finished 4th or 5th, we don't remember their name, but he or her gets a lot of thrill out of that. He or she represented their institution, okay, their country, of course, but we're representing a particular institution, and I think we should basically celebrate our achievements, particularly when we reach those sort of goals that we've set. In addition to thinking about this idea of building track record, I was also led to think about a prison record. Okay, and what I mean by this is that when you build a track record, and particularly if you look at the role of prison, for those who offend, okay, obviously there's juvenile arrangements, there's minimum security, medium security, and high security type environments. And within that, there are, if you like, established orders, and people are respected for particular types of crime. If you look at that, you know, there are certain crimes that are almost lauded and certain crimes that are not. But in that sort of idea of building a record, there is also a progression. And I think what we're trying to do today, and what I'll try and sort of illustrate, is that records, such as a criminal record, takes time to develop, of course, and also the notion of a record means different things in different contexts. What I mean by this is that I've recently returned to Australia, and I'll talk a little bit more about my journey shortly, but I was in the European context for about 4.5 years. Specifically, I was working in France. Now, in the French context and the German context, the notion of building a track record is very different, in the sense that you have a team, the idea of what Ken was referring to, where the professor literally determines the show. In the French context, there are 2 categories of staff, professor and maître de conférence, which basically means unimportant. Okay, and so there's very much a status and elitism aspect to the French environment. The German environment also operates around designated research teams. In both environments, as well as some other European countries, they are required to have what's called a habilitation degree, which is really permission to supervise. So if you see someone who says they're professor, doctor, literally, this is someone very important in a German university system. Okay, so there's very much a kind of notion of building track record does vary in different national contexts, and I believe also in different fields of study. So for one field of study, the role of the book, the published book, is critical. In other fields, they don't care about that. So really we need to appreciate that the types of outputs will vary across different fields, and I think we need to appreciate that. The other thing also that I would just remind us of is, there are changing requirements. We are operating in, I guess, a game, if we want to use that metaphor again, the publishing, the research game. We're quite comfortable using that terminology. But of course, this game has different requirements. The player of yesterday has to be bigger, fitter, stronger, faster, of course. So the requirements from perhaps when Ken started out as what was an acceptable level of output is not the same today. And really in the last 10, 15 years, the impetus for outputs has really come down on, I think, all of us at all levels, very much so. I would also pose the question that if we are playing in this game, this research game, building a track record, the question obviously is who sets these rules, and are these rules actually uniformly understood? And my answer to that is really, well, the latter is no. Really, we're operating in quite a subjective environment, particularly when the interpretation of what is track record is not so clear. Okay, it's not so clear cut. It can be a contestation around what is deemed a record, a research record. In the area of marketing, and I'm not a marketer, marketers will talk about the 4 Ps. This is like their Bible, okay? The 4 Ps of price, promotion, place or distribution, and place, where you put your product, okay? I've borrowed those terms, the 4 Ps. I'm going to talk about 4 Ps here briefly. That is purpose, priorities, the purpose of building research, priorities, the politics surrounding research, and promotion, okay, just very briefly. And really the purpose here is where and how to define yourself as a researcher. This is really about your identity group, your community. And in some ways, it comes to the heart of the question is, what is the community to which you belong? Increasingly, and I think this is a sort of a sense in the last 10 years at least, let's say in the Australian context, is that there's been an attempt to develop issues of collaboration, engagement, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary. And of course the tension is how do you define a clear identity to which you're part of, a community of researchers. Interdisciplinarity, if you like, is very useful, and I really operate in much the same way. But at the same time, I see a danger in that, in the sense that there's also a dilution where people say, well, who are you? Where do you belong? Which category of grant criteria do you apply for? Are you applying for a law and security? Is it about health and well-being? Is it really education? And I think we all struggle from time to time in terms of really locating ourselves periodically. So I think it's really to identify purpose. Priorities. Here we have, I think, the issue of the institutional system of which we're a part. Currently it's ECU, but also the priority around choice. How much choice can I exercise when certain outputs are valued and others are not? And sometimes we all do sort of like to exercise choice as researchers. We like to take on, the ability. We like the ability to say yes or no to certain projects, certain proposals. even if sometimes our institutions won't necessarily measure them in such a way, I've tended to probably still exercise some choice while meeting those institutional systems. So I've always had this sort of difficulty of neatly ensuring I'm fitting the institutional outputs, which I try to ensure that, of course, occurs, whilst not limiting choice. Because I think one of the pleasures of research is really being paid to do what is fundamentally a hobby. And I find that incredibly wonderful, and you can choose the topics that we do. So I think that notion of priorities is something that really we have to keep in the forefront. The politics, number 3, the politics of research. Here where I draw on attribution, where of course any successes, we claim as our own, any failures, it's the other. Okay, they've inhibited me, they've frustrated me, the institution has not funded my research, the ARC and their madness have not seen the wisdom of what I'm proposing, this is life-changing stuff. Okay, so this notion about the politics of research, blind peer review, sometimes isn't always so blind. Okay, the notion of journal special issues and the negotiation around that. There's a lot of aspects around the politics of research, co-authoring, and various other things that I've seen, particularly where there's, if you like, multi-authoring around basically the same idea, or multi-publishing. I liken it to hanging the washing out over and over again. Change the title, tweak a few things, but basically there's I've seen increasing evidence, at least in the field of business and law, and maybe in other fields too, where the pressures are encouraging those sort of behaviours. And I sadly say that is what I've observed. The fourth and final one briefly is promotion. And I tend to see promotion, if you like, as a consequence of building a track record. But I also encourage people to see promotion in its full sense, not just formally, but also informally. What I mean by this is informal promotion can be really saying, look, we want you to head up something. We want you to take on board and run with this project. We would like you to get 2 or 3 people together and put together something, to invite a team to come on campus to do something. In other words, the informal aspects are a reflection, I think, of some of the good outcomes that are actually being produced. So I would encourage a lot of us to think not just in formal, explicit terms about promotion, but to recognise that some of the opportunities that have come our way and will come our way are part of the informal aspects to promotion, being entrusted with a greater sense of responsibility in order to build something for yourself and for the institution. Those are the 4 Ps. My own journey briefly. I started across in, I think, Australia's 6th state, which is the far east coast of New Zealand. And I sort of left school very early, got bored with it, but then worked for a number of years and came back to university as a part-time student. I quickly got into university life very easily because I really enjoyed it. I never thought about entering a career. Money wasn't an issue for me. I was always poor, so I never knew what I missed. So that was one of my issues. The critical point, I think, when I reflect back in terms of some of the critical, I guess, success factors was that I didn't do an honours degree. I did a sort of a 12-month master's coursework in dissertation. Now, I didn't think that was sufficient training for me. That was my own decision, and I enrolled in a research master's only, okay? And I changed institutions, and this is partly the journey of movement, if you like. I changed institutions. I had the option and I could, so I moved institutions. I did a master's by research, and as a result of that, I managed to publish 4 journal articles. Miraculously, I think 3 in B category journals and 1 C. But what that did, and I never realised at the time, is that one, it didn't qualify me for scholarship because at that stage, going back a period of a number of years, you needed an honours degree. So I was still poor. What that meant is poverty actually focused me, a bit like Ken. Poverty had that sense of focusing my attention. So those 4 articles, what it did, 2 of them were published prior to applying for a PhD program. 2 of them were while I was in the PhD program. So I started to understand the notion of pipeline and planning ahead and thinking of a schedule. And I always like going into people's offices, and you often see, you know, to-do list, where it's at, and all of that stuff. And I think it's great, because it actually formally recognises that people are understanding the notion of pipeline and the delays in time that it takes to get research into the various outlets that we're aspiring for. So that was particularly important. And then, so those 4 articles were very helpful to get me into a PhD program. I was enrolled at that time at the University of Sydney, my PhD. I completed that in fast time. Well, it's probably not that fast, but it was 3 years and 2 months or something. But that equally was a 6-day working week. Okay, hence my reference back to the sort of focus of not having cash. By this stage, it suddenly dawned on me I could actually get paid for doing what I like doing, which is research. I hadn't thought about it up to that point. So that was kind of very accidental in some way, or incidental. My PhD, again, I published 2 articles out of that prior to finishing, and that's fortunately, to use the old terminology, both of those were A-star publications, which immediately gave me an offer of a job at Sydney. So they kind of, it's not so common to be offered a job in your current place, but they said, we'd like you to stick around. Okay, I did. I stuck around 12 years. In that time, I continued just to sort of regularly track various outputs, make sure there were subsequent publications. In my field, journal articles were important, but we also valued other things. And one of the things that I did as a PhD student, and I still like to encourage, is that people, my students or colleagues, I encourage them to review for journals. I find that's a valuable visibility exercise. I also encourage them, even though this wasn't valued by the then University of Sydney system, I don't think it was changed. I said, look, why not do a book review? I did them, and the reason I did them is I got a $100 book for free, but it actually forced me to critically read a book, which was valuable for my research. And people said, look, you've got a quick visibility now. You're in a pretty good journal, you're in the back section, but you're kind of there. And I think the first time you sort of see yourself in a higher journal, you think, well, maybe I could have a crack at the real sections, which means the front end. Okay, so I often saw book reviews, reviewing for journals, ARC type applications, being asked to review for other organisations as well. I saw that as part of the responsibility I had as a researcher, fledgling researcher. And I sort of think at this stage, what really changed was the shift that Ken referred to, I think, is the multi-author game, if you like. Very few single-author people are out there now, okay? They've almost become an extinct species like the Tasmanian tiger. I just sort of don't see a lot of single-author activity, at least in the field of business and law. That's really dropped off. Sciences, I think it's traditionally been multi-author for a long time. So I think this reflects the wider context of the quantum. But what I think has been important is to always sort of keep a little bit of an eye on the quantity-quality aspect. And I've got a couple of rhetorical questions that I'll sort of put out towards the end. I guess to some extent you're caught between the bind of, do we just only wait for quality? What I mean by that is, do we take the short term, what I call the Q&N? The Q&N is the quick and nasty. The quick and nasty publication gets us gives us a regular sense on our CVs to show there's output happening all the time? Or do we sort of wait for what I call patient publishing, where maybe nothing has happened for 2 years, but yet, boom, we strike, the top. And then again, a couple of years later, we wait and again, this kind of major splash. And I think that sort of quantity-quality issue is always a bit of a trade-off, in all honesty. People get, I think, pressures to accept both from time to time and wish to be part of both. I think what sort of got me sort of very much into the sort of I suppose thinking about this as a political exercise as much as anything is that, I realised, reasonably early on is that, people were pretty, I think sometimes, how shall I say it, perhaps less than collegial. And what I felt was really needing was ensuring that there was strong, what I call research mentors and champions that actually looked after early career researchers, PhD students. And I sort of felt that at particular times across the different institutions that I've worked at, that always wasn't the case. So I'm very pleased to sort of think, come here with the notions of engagement, partnership, collaboration. I certainly believe that those are important issues to engage with, and that was partly, among other things, why I chose to come to ECU around those. I definitely felt that moving countries was helpful in terms of building a career. Now that may not be possible for everyone. I've moved a number of institutions, so I was 2 universities in New Zealand, University of Sydney, Western France, and then back to Australia. I became a professor 4 years ago, but I've been working sort of as an academic 17 years. So I guess what I've focused on is really ensured that output was regular. I managed a research centre. So part of building track record was also to look at alternative sources of funding. Here, of course, we have category 1, but there's also different categories of research. In the area of business and economics in general, category 1 grants in Australia are very tough and very limited. That's a national sort of result. Very tough. And so what a lot of colleagues, including myself, is to say, look, we would go to private industry sources for it. And so myself and some colleagues have spent a lot of time just basically going to industry to see what else can be funded. My view was sort of fairly liberal, small L, in the sense of saying, look, if the money is coming in and it's supporting what we want to do and the outputs, research outputs are there, why not? So I was reasonably relaxed about that, and particularly looking at the internationalisation of stuff. Obviously spending a lot of time in the French and European research context, a lot of money in that context, a lot of researchers, a lot of interesting stuff happening there. So part of it is to really ensure that this research, building a research track record is there. So really what I want to do as an associate dean is to basically share that, okay, and to ensure that people here are part and parcel of that. It doesn't mean I need to collaborate and co-write with people, but if I see people achieving new successes, I think that's really sort of partly a job well done. A couple of things, and I'll finish on these 3 points. Three points. A question that I will pose. I do have a handout, so if people want to take it away, the points that I've said are on paper. The question that I leave you with here is, to what extent does your CV accurately reflect your track record? Okay, most people will think their CV captures their track record. I don't necessarily see the CV and the track record as being one and the same thing. So what I'm sort of getting you to think about is, how do you actually present your CV in terms of best reflecting who you are as a researcher and your achievements? How do you categorise your various outputs. Okay. In what order are these presented? Because that's very important as well to think about. A second one, and this is really Ken's question as well, is what is better for building track record? The narrow focus, okay, the study of the postage stamp, okay, or to cast your net more widely, you know, you're interested in all sea animals. Okay, what's the best strategy? You know, rifle or shotgun, basically. Okay, and I think there are different approaches there. And then the third kind of issue to ponder is how can a research track record be built when the notion of record is open to interpretation across different fields, across different national contexts, and taking into account relative contribution. Okay? In other words, how do you actually build this? So really what I'm trying to sort of highlight is that there are many paths, and I think Will and others will also talk about the role of mentoring and so on. There are many paths to building a research journey, so I wouldn't get hung up. I definitely wouldn't get hung up. The day that you get hung up is probably the time you should hang up on research, okay? So don't get hung up about not achieving. Think about you setting your own goals vis-a-vis the institutional outputs. And I want to see people like the 4th or 5th place finisher celebrating his or her success, because that's excellent, okay? Don't get hung up, because when that happens, I think then you start to lose the focus on and the fun and the interest, okay? Research becomes an obsession rather than the enjoyment, okay? I'm conscious of the pressures we're all under, okay? But try and keep that thought in the back of your mind. Enjoy the research, okay? So I've basically got copies of that if you need something or would like it to